The area of the Beis Hamikdash was not flat, and that is not accidental. In fact, it speaks to the heart of what the Beis Hamikdash is all about. Let's look at where the Rambam discusses this. Because of our Rambam Behilchos Beis Abchira, the Rambam discusses in the laws of the Beis Hamikdash. Hamikdash kuloi loy haya b'mishar. The entire Beis Hamikdash was not on a flat plain, ele b'mayla hahar, but rather on an elevated mountainside. And then he goes into the details of how each piece of the Beis Hamikdash was at a different elevation. When a person entered the Har HaBayis from the eastern gate, he'd go all the way to the Chel wall around the external part of the Beis Hamikdash on a flat plain. Then, to get from there to the women's courtyard was 12 steps up. The women's courtyard was flat. Then from there you'd go into the Israelite courtyard, as it's called, which is the beginning of the main courtyard, by ascending 15 steps. That small area, which was for people who came to bring the karbanos, was flat. Then there was a 1 amma step up to the area where the Kohanim used to work. And the entire area where the Kohanim worked, including the Mizbech, was all flat. And then there were 12 steps from there up into the antechamber of the main building of the Beis Hamikdash. And all the internal buildings of the main structure of the Beis Hamikdash were all flat. So the question over here is, why does the Rambam start this from a negative perspective, telling us that it was not flat, instead of just saying that there was a series of elevations? The fact that the Rambam immediately took the shlila, the negative, to say that the Beis Hamikdash was not built on a flat plain, but specifically on the grading ascents of the base of the Har HaBayis, without just saying this is how it was laid out. He could have just said the Beis Hamikdash was built into the mountainside. The reason is because the Rambam holds that when the Torah gives us a positive mitzvah, which is fulfilled by building the Beis Hamikdash, that mitzvah that mitzvah is a continuation of the mitzvah to build a Mishkan, which the Yidden did through Moshe in the Midbar. As the Rambam wrote in the beginning of the halachas about the Beis Hamikdash, in fact, the Rambam reiterated the similarity and connection between the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan by describing that the things that are in the Beis Hamikdash are similar to the things that were in the Mishkan. He says these are the key factors that were necessary in order to build the Beis Hamikdash. You have to make a holy area, which we call a heichal, the holy of holies. And in front of the kodesh, you had to have an entrance hall, which is called the ulam. And all three of them together called the heichal. And then around that, at a distance, you put walls which represent the curtains that were up to create the courtyard around the Mishkan. So there's a direct relationship between the Beis Hamikdash design and the Mishkan design. Anything that is within those walls, which is similar to the courtyard of the Oyel Moed, again linking it back to the Mishkan, that is what's called the courtyard, and all of that together is called the Beis Hamikdash, or at least the holy part of the Beis Hamikdash, and then you have the Ezras Noshim. It's very clear that what the Rambam is illustrating is that the core elements of the Beis Hamikdash are a reflection of and very similar to the core elements of the Mishkan. So there's a link, not just because the mitzvah V'aseh Mikdash was said by the Mishkan and now applies to the Beis Hamikdash. But similarly, it's not really core to our conversation over here, but similarly, the Rambam identifies that in the same way as in the Mishkan in the desert, there were 3 different camps where the Yidden lived. So in the Beis Hamikdash, there are also 3 different major sections. So because the Rambam makes this association between the design of the Beis Hamikdash and the design of the Mishkan, you would have thought the Mishkan was on a flat plain. And we assume that there was no part of the Mishkan that was supposed to be higher than any other part. So you would have thought, you would have assumed the same for the Beis Hamikdash, it should be on one level. So therefore, immediately the Rambam has to start the conversation by addressing this and telling us that the Beis Hamikdash was not on one flat level like the Mishkan, but it was built into the elevation of the mountain. Okay, so now we get why the Rambam said it in the way that he did. The question is, why does he have to get into this conversation in the first place? The Rambam clearly makes Mishnah Torah all about halacha. Therefore, if the Rambam tells us that the Beis Hamikdash was not on a flat plain, but specifically into the grading of the mountain, it's not just because he's describing to us how the Beis Hamikdash actually looked. Because the Beis Hamikdash was built on the slope of a mountain, the only way to design the Beis Hamikdash was with levels. But rather, the Rambam is telling us these levels in the Beis Hamikdash are relevant to the halachic requirements of the Beis Hamikdash. And the two parts of the halachic requirements, there's something you have to avoid and there's something you have to ensure. The first thing you have to prevent is that the Beis Hamikdash should not be on a flat plane. That's an halachic requirement of the Beis Hamikdash. And then the fact that the Beis Hamikdash has to then be built into the slope of the mountain, which you might say is just pragmatic because that's what it looks like, that's actually a requirement halachically for the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, you could say even further. The fact that the Rambam said, Loi, it's not flat, Ella, but specifically graded. Instead of saying the other way around, that the Beis Hamikdash was built into the mountainside and was not flat. That tells you that the Rambam's not saying ideally the Beis Hamikdash should be graded. It's telling you if the Beis Hamikdash is not graded and therefore it's flat, you're not allowed to build the Beis Hamikdash that way. It would disqualify the Beis Hamikdash. That's halacha. For which reason we now have to understand. Seeing as the Rambam's shita is that building the Beis Hamikdash is an extension of a mitzvah that began in the desert to build a Mishkan. And as we've already pointed out, the design elements of the Beis Hamikdash reflect the design elements of the Mishkan. Why is it that in this particular detail, the Beis Hamikdash has to be different from the Mishkan? So in many other details, it's got to be very much like the Mishkan, but now the leveling has to be completely different to the Mishkan. Why? You'll say that's not the only difference between the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. There are various other differences. For example, the Beis Hamikdash was considerably larger than the Mishkan, and many of the building details are very different to the Mishkan. So, the Rebbe says, first of all, anytime that there is a difference in how the Beis Hamikdash was built, you have to explore why that is. It's not the only place where we're asking the question. This is the one that's relevant for us now, is to understand why it's built on different heights. But the concept of anything about the Beis Hamikdash being different to the Mishkan is something you have to explore. But secondly, some of them you don't have to explore too far because the reason is obvious. The Beis Hamikdash was primarily built out of stone, which is God of Gavoya Harbi Yosem Mishkan v'chulei. Therefore, could be both bigger and taller than the Mishkan was intended to be. And it had to be permanent and had to remain in the same place for many generations, unlike the Mishkan, which had to move around. So that's going to make difference, of course, because the Mishkan has to be as lightweight and portable as possible, and the Beis Hamikdash has to be as big and heavy as possible, permanent as possible. And Gimel, the main thing is the thing is that there might be many differences between the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash, but this one the Rambam makes a fuss about. He highlights it. He tells us specifically that the Beis Hamikdash could not be on a flat level like the Mishkan. It has to be on the mountainside. Why? Why is this so important? So we have to understand this. And this will help us to understand the difference between the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. The fact that different parts of the Beis Hamikdash were at different levels, to the extent that you actually had to climb steps to get from the Harabayis to the Ezras Nashim, from the Ezras Nashim to the Ezras Yisrael, from Ezras Yisrael to Ezras Kohanim, from Ezras Kohanim to the Ulam. You had to climb steps. And behesek lekach shebekol behesem lekach shekol echad mimikoyim yisrael oisei teisefes v'aliyah b'kedusha b'yachas l'mokim shelefonav. It's not accidental or incidental. That's because each place where you have to climb steps to enter means you are now going up a level in holiness compared to where you were before. As the Rambam will explain the different levels of kedusha that exist from Eretz Yisrael all the way to Kodesh HaKadoshim. And that lends itself then to tell us the fact that the Beis Hamikdash could not be built flat, but had to have levels. That is not only because of the topography of the mountain, but it's because of the different levels of holiness in the Beis Hamikdash. Any place in the Beis Hamikdash that is higher than the preceding place is also spiritually higher or holier than the preceding place. And that's a halacha that is only relevant to the Beis Hamikdash, not in the Mishkan. Because the concept that different levels of holiness should influence the physical space, that's because the Beis Hamikdash introduced a whole different concept of holiness that the Mishkan didn't have. And when you understand what that concept of holiness is, then it becomes the most logical thing in the world that the Beis Hamikdash should have all of these elevated spaces, which the Mishkan did not. What does that mean? Now, as Barabas' explanation is this. There's a fundamental difference between the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash in terms of purpose, in terms of impact. The first glaring difference is that the Mishkan was a temporary dwelling. As the pasuk says clearly, that David says, I'm going to move, so that implies the temporary nature that is going to move from place to place. But oil, and it's compared to a tent, the Mishkan. The Rambam himself says that the Mishkan Moshe made was intended to be temporary. Whereas the Beis Hamikdash is defined specifically as a place that is permanent. As the Rambam says it, from the moment the Beis Hamikdash was constructed in Yerushalayim, it became forbidden to build a home of that kind for Hashem anywhere else, or lakrib one carbon, and to bring a carbon anywhere else. There is only one place that is a generational home for Hashem, and that is in Yerushalayim, and more specifically on Har HaMoriyah. So that's the fundamental glaring difference between them. Mishkan is temporary, Beis Hamikdash is permanent. So how does that translate into the difference of how the holiness manifests in the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash? In the Mishkan, the holiness and the divine presence was in the elements of the Mishkan itself. The walls, the boards, the covers of the different skins of animals, etc., which were designated with the special oil and therefore became permanent fixtures of holiness. And they didn't change over the 40 years of the desert and even beyond, because Ma'aseh Moshe never disappear. So the Mishkan is hidden away somewhere and is still intact. What the Beis Hamikdash added is that the location of the Beis Hamikdash became holy. That never occurred with the Mishkan. The place the Beis Hamikdash stood on became a holy place. And that manifests in two ways. That's why you see in our parasha that the description of the Beis Hamikdash is a place that the Eibishter will choose. The Mishkan is not a place. The Mishkan is an entity. Second of all, not only that, but there was actually a process that David HaMelech made in order to designate a certain area that should become the place of the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, the Gemara even debates how deep that impact goes. Is it a surface level, or is it all the way to the core of the earth? But the point is, the physical place becomes holy as opposed in the Mishkan. You'll say, but in the Mishkan we're told that when it comes to the halach of the soita, where you had to put sand into the water that the soita was going to drink, the Torah tells us that you take that sand from the floor of the Mishkan. That sounds like the floor belongs to the Mishkan. Sounds like the place is holy. So number one, yes, it was holy when the Mishkan was there. As soon as the Mishkan left, gone, that's the end of the holiness. Similar to Har Sinai. After the revelation is over, Har Sinai has absolutely no spiritual relevance. But even while the Mishkan was there, It's not that there's something inherently holy in the sand under the Mishkan that we're therefore using it for the Saita. And it's rather because currently there's a holy entity standing on that sand, which currently imbues it with holiness in the now. Now, because the objective of the Mishkan was not to make the place holy, whereas the objective of the Mikdash is, so the nature of location is different for the Mishkan for the Beis Hamikdash. With the Mishkan, you pack it up and you go. The original place where the Mishkan stood has zero holiness now. Similar to the end of Matan Torah, when you blow a shofar now, everybody is allowed access to the mountain. It retains no kedusha at all. The Beis Hamikdash is the exact opposite. The Rambam paskins lahalocha shemakriven hakarbonos kulon, that even in the absence of the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, you can bring any korban, afal pi she'ein sham bayis bonoi, even if there's no Beis Hamikdash standing there, and you can eat the holiest kinds of sacrifices in the area of the Azora, assuming you know exactly where it is, but even if it's destroyed, and it's not currently surrounded by the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. Why is that? Because the place became permanently sanctified, holy, because the Shekhinah was there. As the pasuk says, the place is a place that David chose. Hashem chose the location, and therefore the holiness is in that location forever. Unlike the Mishkan, where the Abishah chose the Mishkan, not the place. Okay, so now that we know that the location, the geography becomes holy, then you can appreciate that there could be different levels of holiness in different geographical locations associated with the Beis Hamikdash. This halacha, that the Beis Hamikdash could not be built flat and had to be built into the grade of the mountain, and the fact that there are different levels of holiness at different parts of the Beis Hamikdash, which represent different levels of, so there's different altitudes representing different levels of holiness. And that is a spiritual innovation in the physical world that only exists in the context of the Beis Hamikdash. Because we're dealing here with the Beis Hamikdash, where the nature of the holiness relates to the place. It's the place the Eibishter chose. Therefore, if we're talking about a Beis Hamikdash that is holy, and we're talking about the fact that the Eibishter chose the place to be holy, then the Beis Hamikdash could have different effects on different places within that system. The height that distinguishes one place from the next, Ezras Noshim from Ezras Yisrael, for example, or Ezras Kohanim from the Ulam, for example, because the kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash in this place is not generic, affecting the entire Beis Hamikdash equally. There are different levels of holiness, as the Rambam spells out, and they are and they are dependent on what the particular role is of a particular place. Within the Beis Hamikdash, Kodesh HaKadoshim is the ultimate. And the unique kedusha of each place is eternal. Even if there's no physical Beis Hamikdash there, as we saw, the Rambam tell us that you could eat the holiest type of korban, where the halacha is you may only eat that korban in the Azara. And he says you could eat it b'chola azara for. If you know where the azara is, you can eat those karbones now, even though there's no Beis Hamikdash there. Why? Because the unique holiness of the azara is still in that particular place, as opposed to a few meters over. The Mishkan didn't have that. The Mishkan was not set in a particular location. There's no reference in the Torah that it's the place Hashem chose. What made it holy was the different parts of it. The boards that made the walls were holy. The skins that made the roof, they were holy. So therefore the fact that this is a kodesh and that is a chatzar that had no impact on the location in which the Mishkan is currently sitting, because the objective of the Mishkan is not to affect the place. That's why the Mishkan is flat. Because there is no fundamental difference in impact on this earth between one part of the Mishkan and the other. So therefore there should be no elevation. That's why the Rambam had to highlight that this is a big distinction between the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan. Yes, there are other distinctions, but this speaks to the heart of what the difference between a Mishkan and a Mikdash is. Even though there are many other differences that you could identify. The fact that the Beis Hamikdash was not flat and was specifically built into the slope of the mountain, that distinction between not only the level of holiness in each place, but the level of physical space, that illustrates the big difference between the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan. Because the Beis Hamikdash is a place Hashem chose. The Beis Hamikdash and its components had a very powerful impact on that place, and you can see it b'gashmis because that place is higher. Now, at this point, you should have a very clear, obvious question. We need to understand. Now that we've identified that the different elevations reflect different spiritual levels, the fact that this part of the Beis Hamikdash is higher than that part of the Beis Hamikdash, therefore the physical elevation of this piece of the Beis Hamikdash is higher than the physical elevation of that one. The big question is, surely there should have been steps, and there should have been many steps to lead to a much elevated place called the Kodesh HaKadoshim. How come it is that there's no such thing? The degree of holiness of the Kodesh HaKadoshim is fundamentally different to every other part of the Beis Hamikdash. Kishmoy Kodesh Legabei HaKadoshim. The name itself tells you it's Kodesh HaKadoshim. Out of all the Kedusha that exists, this is the holiest of all the holy. The Rambam will explain when he goes through the 10 levels of Kedusha that exist in Israel. He'll spell out for us that the very pinnacle of all holiness is the Kodesh HaKadoshim. He goes through what the impact is of each level of holiness. Who can go in? What kind of purity do you have to have? So what's the holiest? Only the Kohen Gadol, only Yom Kippur, only one in the midst of the Avodah. So logically, then surely the Kodesh HaKadoshim should have been the physically highest point of the entire building. So how come it isn't? How come there's no distinction between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim? The only way to answer this is to understand how Chassidus appreciates the difference between the impact the Beis Hamikdash versus the Mishkan had on our world. The Mishkan, which was a temporary abode for the Eibishter, was primarily made out of wood, which were the boards of the Mishkan that made up the body of the Mishkan, and the various coverings at the top. Many of them were from skins of animals, and some of them were wool, which is also from animals, right? The skins of animals are wool. The only part of the Mishkan that was mineral was the floor that it was on, and that was only temporary. That floor was not part of the Mishkan. It was just a staging ground for the Mishkan. Whereas the Beis Hamikdash is the exact opposite. This place that was the permanent home for Hashem was primarily made out of stone, which is doimim, the inanimate world. The Rambam tells us clearly that you're not allowed to have any visible wood in the entire structure of the Beis Hamikdash. It's either rock or stone. Doimim, which is doimim, the lowest life form, lower than wood, which comes from tzomech, the plant kingdom, which is what most of the Mishkan was made out of, and certainly lower than chai, animals, from which the tops of the Mishkan were made out of. Why is that? The explanation is, the primary objective of the Mishkan was not really to fundamentally transform the world in the long term. Rather, the Mishkan was supposed to be a model on earth to reflect the whole spiritual hierarchy of existence. So therefore, the design of the Mishkan reflected the nature of the spiritual hierarchy. What's right at the top? Coverings that are made from things that come from animals, skin and wool. And so it is not only the top level of the cover of the Mishkan, but all the layers beneath it as well. All from the world of Chai, the highest world, the highest life form. Then you have the lower parts of the Mishkan, which include certain other areas, including curtains, etc. And then you have the boards of which the Mishkan was actually made, and that's how you that's made out of plant life. And then the very bottom of the Mishkan is silver bases that held the walls, and the sand itself, that's all from the world of the inanimate. That's exactly how Yishtalshlus works. More developed beings are higher, less developed beings are lower. So what's the big innovation of the Beis Hamikdash compared to the Mishkan is it's that in the Beis Hamikdash you could see that the Eibusha's home, which is the objective of the whole of creation, should be manifest in the very lowest components of this existence. I know, in other words, the holiness or the manifestation of Hashem's presence should be brought down into the world and should seep into the world into the very lowest part of the world, the inanimate. A reality that doesn't appear to be alive and that doesn't appear to have anything spiritual to it. That is the goal of the Beis Hamikdash. Get the holiness in there. The Mishkan doesn't really do that. The Mishkan just shows us a hierarchy of life forms, and we kind of leave the doimim out of it mostly. Seeing as the goal of the Beis Hamikdash is to bring holiness into the physical and to infuse it through the physical, and therefore to elevate the physical, that wasn't only something expressed in the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, but in the earth itself. That's why the Beis Hamikdash in the first place is on a mountain, a place that sticks out high, and then everything in the surrounding area to illustrate that we're taking the physical world and we're elevating it. The Tzemach Tzedek has a beautiful explanation that mountains are formed by geological movement that forces the earth upwards, and that represents the elevation of our world. Now, in that concept of being higher than the Gashmistic world, there are different components depending on how high they are in terms of their holiness. Their place was equally higher begashmis. And that speaks to the heart of what the Beis Hamikdash is doing. It's transforming the world. You can see it physically. Look, it's going higher and higher. Mishkan, which you don't see in the Mishkan. The objective of the Mishkan was not to infuse the divine presence into the lowly, physical, inanimate world, the lowest of the low. So in the Mishkan's reality, the divine presence there is almost in a sense separate from the world in which it's manifest. It didn't translate into or express itself in a change to the physical environment, because that's not what the Mishkan was there to achieve. And therefore, despite the fact that the Mishkan has all these different levels of holiness built into it, because it also has an outer area and an inner area and a Kodesh HaKadoshim, etc., the physical manifestation of all of that spirituality remains flat. There's no raising up each piece of land to reflect the spirituality within it. The Mishkan is flat. Not only is it flat, it's the same level as the desert, which is not Mishkan. Why? Because the Mishkan is not lifting, elevating, transforming the world. Okay, so now that we know that, still, why is the Kodesh HaKadoshim not higher than the rest? That explains why the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holiest of the holy, was not higher than the Heichal that preceded it. Because inyan zeh, The concept that the holiness of the Beis Hamikdash should impact an elevation of the physical space, which is why this part of the Beis Hamikdash should be higher than that part of the Beis Hamikdash, aligned with the distinctions between them in holiness. The only way that you could have this is higher than that is if there is a relativity between them. Relative to the one that's higher than you. For example, in order to go from the Chel to the Ezes Nashim, it's 12 degrees removed. That's a relative growth. 15 degrees removed from the Ezes Nashim to the Ezes Yisrael. That tells you it's greater, but it's relatively greater. It's so many steps higher. But when you're talking about the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which means that it's a spiritual leap, that it is be'ein aroich, it's not even in the same league. In fact, it doesn't even belong to comparisons of higher or lower, because higher and lower automatically tells you relativity. Now we're talking about something which is not relative, it's not measured on that scale. Because we're talking about something which is infinitely greater, it doesn't make sense now that you can trace this shift, this improvement in steps. And therefore it makes no sense that there should be a different physical height. It's got nothing to do with that. You can't compare. It's a different world. Nothing you're going to do on earth to show elevation is going to reflect the elevation of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's the distinction between the Kodesh HaKadoshim and every other part of the Beis Hamikdash. In every part of the Beis Hamikdash, this part of the Beis Hamikdash is higher than that part of the Beis Hamikdash, in a relative sense. This part of the Beis Hamikdash has a relative greatness compared to that part of the Beis Hamikdash. It's like saying this person has $100,000 and that person has $1 million. Okay, they're relative to each other. This one's greater, but you can see the relativity. You can see how you get from 100,000 to $1 million. So, because there's a relative difference in spirituality, there's also a relative ascent from one level to the other, and that's why one is physically higher than the other. But the minute you enter the world of the Kodesh HaKadoshim and its holiness, there you're talking about a leap of greatness which is in no way comparable to any of the other elements of the Beis Hamikdash. Not only is it greater than the Beis Hamikdash, than the previous level of the Beis Hamikdash, it's greater than greatness. It's greater than comparison. The Kodesh HaKadoshim is a place that manifests Hashem's essence, which is beyond any kind of rules or any kind of predictions or any kind of understanding. And that's expressed in the place occupied by the Oren, which occupies space and does not occupy space simultaneously, because higher, lower, bigger, smaller is all irrelevant. That is something that cannot be expressed. It cannot be expressed in space, it cannot be expressed in height, cannot be expressed in difference. And there's another part to this as well. Let's go back to exactly how the Rambam described what happened when you go through this experience of entering the Beis Hamikdash and going up all the levels. He says, when a person comes in, he comes in from the east, you walk to the end of the Chel, at one level. Then you go up. You go up 12 steps to get to the Ezes Nashim. Then he's describing a person. It's a walkthrough. You then walk the flat, the whole Ezes Nashim. Then you go up 15 steps to get to the Ezes Yisrael, etc. Means that the Rambam's not coming so much from the angle of the relative heights of the different parts of the Beis Hamikdash, speaking more about the person who's inside the Beis Hamikdash. Why is he doing that? The Rambam's alluding to the idea when a person goes through this ongoing spiritual elevation of all these different layers of holiness, you shouldn't just be walking through the Beis Hamikdash. You shouldn't just be experiencing all these holy places. You should be elevating yourself at each station. The person has to elevate themselves through this experience. But if you were to discuss the level of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there's nothing you could do to elevate yourself. It's beyond humans. It's beyond creation. It's beyond anything that is mugbal. The truth of the matter is that when a person's confronted with the stark holiness of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the person disappears. The person melts away. The person has complete bittul. And that's not only in the Beis Hamikdash, where you can't talk about being higher because there isn't a you to talk about. The truth of the matter is that there's a component within ourselves that is at this level. That is the Kodesh HaKadoshim of the personal Beis Hamikdash we all have. The very deepest part of the heart, the Yechida dimension of the soul. That's a part of ourselves that has no description, no dimensions, no limitations. And it certainly is incapable of being expressed. That's why it's represented by the little, what do you want to call it, thorn on top of the letter Yud. It hasn't even taken on the form of the smallest letter. That's the part of ourselves that allows our soul to completely melt into the background and be absolutely submissive to the Eibishter without any limitations, as the Alter Rebbe says. And that's the truest form of connection that I have to the Eibishter, as we say in the Hoshainus. It's Yechida, that dimension of the Neshama that is one, to be one with the Eibishter. And that's the part of ourselves which is Bedugnas Knisas Kohen Gadol K'Shliach Kol Amcha Yisrael B'Chol Makom Shehem. That's similar to the Kohen Gadol going as the representative of the entire Jewish people. Achas B'Shana the Kodesh HaKadoshim, once a year into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. We can actually go into that part within ourselves, meaning that there is a process of spiritual development that each of us can go through, where it's one level beyond the next level, and you can kind of map it out, and you know where you're going. And then there's a dimension of ourselves that is completely beyond levels. It's the core of who we are. It's absolutely one with the Eibishter. It's where we lose a sense of personal identity and recognize that we're part of Hashem's entity, and that's the part of ourselves that is, in a sense, the inner Mashiach, that if we could touch, could help us bring Mashiach immediately.